He was 10 years old, standing barefoot in the heart of the Montana wilderness. With dirt streaking his pale face and fear in his blue eyes, Ethan Cole pressed himself against a fallen log, his small frame trembling as the shadows of the forest grew longer. From the brush only yards away, a massive gray wolf stepped silently into the clearing, its golden eyes fixed on the boy. Ethan froze, expecting teeth and claws. But instead of attacking or retreating, the creature did something that defied the instincts of the wild. It lowered itself to the ground and sat beside him. Hours earlier, Ethan had stumbled alone through the forest after his stepfather's wagon vanished into the distance, leaving behind only dust and cruel words. "You're nothing but trouble, boy. Let the wilderness teach you some sense." The creaking wheels had carried away the only family he had left, however harsh they had been. Now, as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountain ridges, Ethan found himself in country where even seasoned hunters traveled only in groups. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with shifting shadows and cries that made his small heart race. He had shouted until his voice was raw, but the only answer was the mournful call of a crow circling overhead. And yet, in that moment of despair, the wounded wolf chose not to harm him, but to keep watch, as though fate had bound the two of them together against the darkness. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below this video. Thank you, amen. The autumn winds of Montana carried with them the faint smell of pine and the sharp sting of cold air drifting down from the snow-dusted peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was late afternoon in the high country, and the skies above Copper Hollow, a small frontier town nestled between ridges and timberline, were already bruised with streaks of violet and gray. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches swaying in a restless rhythm, as though warning anyone who dared to wander too far. Somewhere in those woods, a 10-year-old boy named Ethan Cole stumbled over tangled roots, his breath ragged and his small chest heaving from both fear and exhaustion. Ethan Cole was slight for his age, thin shoulders and bony wrists jutting out from a patched wool shirt that once belonged to someone larger. His brown hair was unkempt, falling into his pale blue eyes that carried a sadness too heavy for a child. His face, though youthful, bore the faint hollows of hunger, and his hands were scuffed and raw from having clawed through brambles and clung to rough bark. Ethan had the wary posture of a boy who had learned too early in life that the world was rarely kind. His one goal, burning through the fear in his chest, was simple and desperate: to find his way back to Copper Hollow, the town where his mother had been buried just weeks earlier, and to prove to himself that he was not meant to vanish quietly in the wilderness the way his stepfather wished. Russell Kane, the man who had left him here, was not Ethan's blood, but had married his mother after her first husband's death. Russell was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with a thick beard streaked in black and gray. His eyes were a cold shade of slate, always searching for advantage, and his voice carried the rasp of a man who drank hard liquor more often than water. Once a small-time trader, he had squandered fortunes on gambling and left behind a trail of unpaid debts. What made Russell dangerous was not merely his cruelty, but his ambition. He coveted the patch of land Ethan's mother had inherited, a modest farmstead near Copper Hollow. With Ethan alive, the property might someday revert to him when he came of age. With Ethan gone, Russell could claim it fully and sell it to pay off the men who were circling closer every day, demanding what they were owed. That morning, Russell had loaded Ethan into a wagon under the pretense of gathering firewood. The road wound deeper into the forest, miles beyond where townsfolk normally ventured, until only towering pines and jagged ridges remained. Russell halted near a clearing, the wheels crunching over dry leaves, and told the boy to fetch water from a stream just beyond the trees. When Ethan returned, clutching a tin pail of icy water, the wagon was already rattling down the dirt path, leaving behind only dust, the echo of creaking wood, and his stepfather's last words thrown carelessly over his shoulder. "You're nothing but trouble, boy. Maybe the wilderness will teach you some sense." The sound of hooves faded, until only silence remained, heavy and endless. Ethan had run after the wagon until his legs gave out, shouting, begging, but the forest swallowed his cries. Now, hours later, he stood alone in a sea of shadows as the sun slipped lower behind the mountains. The light turned coppery, spilling through the branches in thin shards, and the temperature dropped quickly. Each breath came in white clouds. The wilderness pressed in with its secrets, the distant caw of a raven, the sharp crack of a branch under unseen weight, the whisper of wind threading through tall grass. Even seasoned hunters from Copper Hollow rarely traveled these woods after dusk. To a 10-year-old boy, every shadow looked like a predator waiting to lunge. Ethan's stomach growled, but he had only a heel of bread left from the morning. His thin jacket was no match for the bite of the coming night. He pressed his small body against the side of a fallen log, trying to make himself smaller, trying to will the tears away that kept streaking down his dirt-smudged cheeks. His goal was clear in his mind: survive the night, and at first light, find a way back to the road that led to Copper Hollow. He pictured the town's narrow main street, the smoke rising from the chimneys of the blacksmith shop and the steeple of the old church where his mother had been buried. He whispered her name under his breath, as though speaking to her might keep the loneliness from suffocating him. But loneliness was not the only thing moving in the trees. From the brush behind him came the softest rustle, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body rigid. He turned slowly, expecting the worst: a bear, a mountain lion, the wolves he had heard men speak of with hushed respect in the taverns of Copper Hollow. Out of the darkness stepped a massive shape, low to the ground, its silver-gray fur bristling in the fading light. A wolf. The creature was larger than any dog Ethan had ever seen, its lean body scarred from battles, its gait slightly uneven as though favoring one leg. Its eyes, however, were what rooted Ethan in place, two molten pools of amber gold that seemed to see straight into him. The boy's heart pounded so hard he thought his chest might split. He pressed himself tighter against the log, remembering every story of wolves tearing livestock apart, of men carrying rifles just to walk to the outhouse after dusk. Yet this wolf did not snarl. It did not advance with bared teeth. Instead, it sat down heavily on its haunches barely 10 feet away, its gaze locked on him with something Ethan could not understand. Not hunger, not threat, but a strange, unsettling patience. The wolf's breath rose in clouds, its ears twitching at distant sounds in the forest. Ethan noticed then the faint hitch in its left foreleg. The animal was limping slightly, as though carrying an old injury. For several long minutes, the clearing held its breath. The boy and the predator locked in a standoff of silence broken only by the occasional rustle of pine needles overhead. Finally, when a cold gust swept through, Ethan shivered violently and pulled his knees to his chest. The wolf's ears swiveled, and it made a low, rumbling sound deep in its throat. Not a growl, but something softer, more resonant. To Ethan's ears, it sounded almost like acknowledgement. Night descended fast. The last rays of sun disappeared behind the ridge, and the forest turned to shadow and frost. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped, and another answered, the sound prickling Ethan's skin with fear. He wrapped his thin arms tighter around himself, realizing how unprepared he was to face the mountain night. The cold seeped into his bones. His teeth chattered, his vision blurred with exhaustion. When he dared glance sideways, the wolf had not moved. It remained seated, silent and steady, like a sentinel carved from stone. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it was waiting until he fell asleep to attack. Perhaps it was too injured to fight but was sizing him up nonetheless. Or perhaps, and the thought startled him, it had chosen, for reasons unknowable, to stay. Whatever the truth, the boy realized he was no longer entirely alone in the endless Montana wilderness. A strange comfort flickered in his chest, fragile as a candle in the wind. As the first stars pricked through the canopy above and the forest filled with the haunting calls of nocturnal hunters, Ethan Cole abandoned, trembling and heartbroken, huddled against the fallen log with a single, unlikely companion. The wolf did not leave. The night in the Montana wilderness deepened into something almost alive, the darkness pressing close with sounds both familiar and terrifying to anyone who had ever set foot beyond Copper Hollow's outer fields. Ethan Cole remained huddled against the fallen log, his knees tucked into his chest, his breath puffing out in uneven clouds of white. Across from him, no more than a few steps away, the wolf sat like a statue, its amber gold eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of starlight. Ethan could hardly believe what was happening. Every story he had ever overheard in the taverns or from men sitting outside the blacksmith shop spoke of wolves as ruthless, cunning killers. Yet here one was, seated beside him as though it had been assigned to watch over him. Ethan's body shook with fear, and at first he dared not move. Each time the trees creaked in the wind or a twig snapped somewhere in the blackness, the wolf's head would lift, ears pricked, muscles tensing. Ethan realized quickly it was not waiting to strike him, but instead was listening for something else. The great animal stood once, circled the small clearing, sniffed the air, then returned to its post as if to reassure itself that the boy was still there. When it finally settled down on its haunches once more, Ethan exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath the entire time. The cold grew sharper, cutting through his thin shirt and jacket. His teeth clattered together until his jaw hurt, and his small fingers, red from exposure, rubbed desperately against his arms. He thought he might not last the night. That was when the wolf shifted closer, so close that Ethan could hear the soft thud of its paws against the leaf-littered ground. The animal lay down fully now, curling its long frame so that the plume of its tail rested near the boy. Ethan froze at first, certain that leaning too close might bring sudden death. But as another freezing gust swept across the clearing, instinct won over terror. Inch by inch he shifted until his back brushed against the wolf's thick fur. The heat that radiated from its body startled him. It was like pressing against a living furnace. For the first time since the wagon had left him behind, Ethan closed his eyes. His shivering slowed, his breathing steadied, and exhaustion pulled him into a fitful sleep. All through the night, the wolf remained awake, lifting its head whenever the forest stirred, its wounded leg trembling occasionally but never giving way. At that same hour, back in Copper Hollow, the town of fewer than 400 souls was quiet under the blanket of autumn night. Lamplight flickered in the windows of the sheriff's office, a squat building of rough-hewn logs at the end of Main Street. Inside, Sheriff Hank Whitmore sat hunched at his desk, staring at the papers scattered before him. Hank was in his late 50s, a tall, broad man with a weathered face lined from years of long patrols under Montana sun and winter storms. His salt and pepper hair peeked out beneath a worn brown hat that rarely left his head. Though stern in appearance, his deep-set blue eyes often betrayed the compassion of a man who had carried too many burdens for others. Hank had lived through enough to recognize lies when he heard them. That afternoon, Russell Kane had appeared in his office, claiming that Ethan Cole had run off after a quarrel. Russell had delivered the story with a shrug, feigning frustration but never once showing true fear for a missing child. Hank hadn't missed the way the man's hands fidgeted, or the way his eyes avoided direct contact. The sheriff had made note of it. Now, long after most of the town slept, Hank traced his finger over a small map pinned to the wall, marking with charcoal the direction Russell claimed to have last seen the boy. It led toward the wilderness terrain no child could survive alone. Leaning back in his chair, Hank thought about Ethan's mother, Ruth. She had died under suspicious circumstances only a month earlier, officially ruled an accident. Hank remembered her as a quiet woman with gentle brown hair and a warm smile, the kind who brought pies to church suppers and treated strangers like neighbors. Something in his gut told him her death and Ethan's sudden disappearance were connected. He decided he would ride out at first light, but not with a posse that might spook Russell. This investigation needed discretion. Hank had always believed in giving a man enough rope to hang himself. Dawn in the forest came with a faint glow creeping between the treetops, silver light washing the frost from pine needles. Ethan stirred awake, surprised to find himself still alive. He shifted, feeling the coarse warmth of the wolf's fur against his back, and when he turned, the animal was already awake, staring at him with unreadable eyes. Ethan dared a whisper. "You're still here." His voice cracked from dryness, but the wolf's ears twitched as though it understood. The boy noticed then the creature's limp more clearly. When it rose to pad around the clearing, its left foreleg dragged slightly, each step measured. The fur around the joint was matted and ragged, perhaps from an old snare or a fight long past. Ethan's heart stirred with something he had not expected, pity. He realized they were alike, both wounded, both left behind in their own way. He murmured quietly, "Guess we're both broken, huh?" The wolf made a low sound, a soft rumble from deep in its chest, neither hostile nor friendly, but it made Ethan's fear ease further. Hunger gnawed at him then, and he remembered the last scrap of bread in his pocket. His hands shook as he pulled it out. The wolf's head snapped toward him, nostrils flaring. Ethan hesitated, then tore the bread in two. He nibbled one half and placed the other on the ground between them. The wolf sniffed, then lowered its head and accepted the offering. Seeing it eat somehow made Ethan feel less alone. He decided, right then, that the wolf was no longer just a terrifying predator. It was his companion, perhaps even his protector. Ashfang, he whispered, naming it from the gray ash-like streaks along its muzzle and the sharp glint of its teeth. The wolf raised its head at the sound, as if acknowledging the title, and then returned to scanning the woods. Back in Copper Hollow, Sheriff Hank Whitmore saddled his horse just as the first sunlight painted the mountains pink. Standing nearby was Clara Jennings, a schoolteacher in her late 20s with a soft face and determined eyes. She wore a long wool coat and carried a satchel heavy with notebooks. Clara was known for her compassion toward the children of the town, many of whom came from broken homes. Her father had died in a mining accident when she was 12, leaving her to help raise her younger siblings, an experience that had carved into her both strength and empathy. "Heading out alone, Sheriff?" she asked, her breath clouding in the morning air. "Not if you're here to scold me about it," Hank replied, tightening the saddle straps. "I'm here because I don't believe Russell Kane either," Clara said firmly, "and because Ethan deserves someone who cares whether he comes home." Hank studied her a moment before nodding. Though he had planned to go alone, Clara's stubbornness and her knowledge of the land around Copper Hollow could prove useful. "All right," he said, "but this isn't a school outing. You keep close, you hear?" Clara smiled faintly. Closer than his stepfather ever kept, I'd wager. Together they rode out of town, following the faint wagon ruts toward the forest. In the woods, Ethan had begun testing his courage. With Ashfang shadowing him, he ventured beyond the clearing, searching for the creek he remembered seeing near the road. His thirst was unbearable. Each time he stumbled over a root or brushed against thorn bushes, the wolf moved with him, circling back when he fell behind, pausing whenever a sound came from the underbrush. Once, when the distant howl of another wolf echoed through the trees, Ashfang bristled, lips curling in silent warning until the sound faded away. Ethan realized with awe that the wolf was guarding him, not hunting him. When he finally reached the creek, he knelt and cupped his hands to drink. The water was bitterly cold, numbing his fingers, but it filled his dry throat with relief. Ashfang stood nearby, lowering its muzzle to lap at the stream as well. Side by side, boy and wolf drank from the same water, and Ethan felt an invisible bond forming stronger than any words could capture. As the day warmed, Ethan considered what to do next. He knew he could not survive long without help. The road must be somewhere nearby, and perhaps if he followed it, he could find his way back to Copper Hollow. But the thought of Russell waiting made his stomach knot. Still, he could not remain lost in the wilderness forever. He looked at Ashfang. "I have to get home," he whispered. The wolf, as though understanding, flicked its ears and began moving ahead, pausing every few steps to glance back. Ethan followed, hope flickering where despair had lived the night before. By late afternoon, Sheriff Hank and Clara dismounted at the edge of the timberline. Hank crouched low, examining the earth. There, in the soft soil, were the faint impressions of small feet. Bare feet. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's him," she said. "God help him." "God help." Hank nodded grimly. "He's out here, and not by choice." The sheriff's eyes hardened. Russell Kane's got more to answer for than he realizes. Together, they followed the trail into the woods, unaware that their path was drawing ever closer to where Ethan and the wounded wolf were making their first fragile steps toward survival, and perhaps toward something larger than either of them could yet imagine. The town of Copper Hollow stirred uneasily beneath the cold Montana sky, morning fog clinging to the rooftops like breath on glass. A place of narrow streets lined with clapboard houses and a single muddy main road, it had always been small enough that every whisper found its way into every ear. By the time Sheriff Hank Whitmore returned from his early ride into the lower timber, a murmur was already spreading. Russell Kane's boy had gone missing. Some said the lad had run away. Others muttered something darker, that the man who had married Ruth Cole after her husband's death had never cared for the boy at all. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, rumors were a dangerous fuel, quick to ignite suspicion into outrage. Sheriff Hank had found enough on his ride to confirm what his instincts already told him. Near the line where the wagon ruts vanished into the trees, he had discovered the faint imprint of small bare feet beside the wheel marks. The size was unmistakable, those of a child, stumbling, unsteady, not at all the stride of someone running away in anger. He crouched there a long time, his broad hands brushing across the dirt, his jaw tightening. A man who had seen decades of crime and hardship, Hank rarely let anger show, but now a flicker of it burned in his blue-gray eyes. He knew what it meant. Ethan hadn't run away. He'd been left. By the time Hank returned to town, Russell Kane was already making the rounds, telling anyone who would listen that the boy was a wild spirit, prone to tantrums, and that he had likely vanished into the woods on his own. Russell's thick frame and booming voice carried authority with those who didn't know him well, but Copper Hollow had long memories. Men at the blacksmith shop and women buying flour at the mercantile exchanged looks that suggested they didn't quite believe his story. Some remembered Ruth's funeral and the way Russell had stood apart, his face as hard as stone while the boy had wept at the graveside. Inside the general store, Martha Greeley, a wiry woman in her 50s with sharp cheekbones and steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, whispered to a neighbor. Martha had lived through hard years, raising 5 children alone after her husband died in a mining collapse, and she had little tolerance for cruelty. "Mark my words," she said, her voice like gravel. "That Kane fellow never wanted the boy. He's after Ruth's land, plain and simple." Others nodded, their eyes shifting toward the sheriff's office. Rumors had become something sharper. Questions. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Ethan Cole and the wolf he had named Ashfang pressed further into the wilderness. The boy's thin legs wobbled with fatigue, and his lips were cracked from thirst, but the wolf remained near, limping with its own hidden pain. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Ethan stumbled across a rocky outcrop where a narrow, dark opening yawned at the base. Relief washed over him. A cave shelter from the cold. The entrance was low, half concealed by fallen branches and ferns. Inside, the air was cool and stale, but it was dry. Ethan crawled in, his small body fitting easily, while Ashfang followed, squeezing its powerful shoulders through with a grunt. The space opened into a chamber barely tall enough for the boy to stand. Ethan slumped against the stone wall, hugging himself for warmth. The wolf lay across from him, lowering its heavy body with a sigh. From his pocket, Ethan drew the last crumbs of the bread he had saved, then reached into a pouch on his belt for something else. 2 strips of jerky his mother had given him weeks before. They were tough and dry, but edible. His stomach clenched with hunger, yet when he looked at Ashfang, the choice came easy. He tore one piece in half and tossed it across the stone floor. The wolf sniffed it, then ate, its amber eyes never leaving his. For the first time, Ethan smiled. "Guess we're both just trying to make it through," he whispered. The cave filled with silence, broken only by the wind moaning through the entrance and the occasional drip of water far inside. Ethan curled closer to the wolf, his thin body trembling, but when his hand brushed the animal's fur, it did not snap. Instead, Ashfang shifted slightly, its thick coat warm against the boy's fingers. That night, 2 creatures, both cast out, both scarred, leaned on one another to survive. Back in Copper Hollow, Sheriff Hank decided he needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. He rode to the edge of town where Jonah Reed, a trapper in his 40s with a scar running down his cheek, lived in a cabin stacked with pelts. Jonah was a man of few words, his hair long and tied back, his brown eyes wary, but he knew the mountains better than anyone alive. When Hank asked if he had seen wagon tracks heading west into the forest, Jonah's answer came after a pause. 2 nights back, Jonah said, his voice low. I saw Kane's wagon where no honest man has reason to be. Empty on the way out. Not so empty on the way in. He didn't elaborate, but Hank read enough in his gaze. Someone had been left behind out there. Hank thanked him, then returned to town, his mind racing. By evening, word of Ethan's disappearance had spread so far that even the children whispered about it in the schoolyard. Clara Jennings heard it too. The young teacher, with her auburn hair pinned neatly back and her gray-green eyes that carried both warmth and a quiet fire, stood at the front of the small schoolhouse. She noticed how Ethan's classmates fidgeted, their eyes straying to his empty desk. She dismissed them early, unable to bear their questions. To her, Ethan had always seemed a gentle boy withdrawn since his mother's death, but kind. She had often seen him linger after class, sketching small animals in the margins of his papers. The thought of him alone in the wild gnawed at her. By the time the sun set, Clara resolved that she would not sit idle. That night, Hank gathered his rifle and prepared to ride at dawn once more. Clara appeared at his door before first light, her coat buttoned to the chin. "I'm coming," she said simply. Hank, who had once promised Ruth he'd keep an eye on the boy, didn't argue. He knew they'd need every bit of resolve for what lay ahead. Far from the safety of town, Ethan slept fitfully in the cave. Dreams tangled with memory, the sound of his mother's voice, the feel of her hand brushing his hair, then Russell's voice, cold and cruel, telling him he was nothing but trouble. Each time he stirred, the warmth of the wolf beside him grounded him in the present. He reached out once in half-sleep, pressing his palm against Ashfang's flank, and whispered, "Don't leave me." The wolf did not move. When morning broke, Ethan woke to the sound of distant howls echoing through the forest. His heart leapt in terror. He turned to Ashfang, who was already standing, fur bristling, teeth bared toward the cave entrance. Ethan realized the truth. The wolf was not just company, it was protection, and whatever prowled out there in the woods was not welcome near the boy. The morning in the Bitterroot Forest came with thin shafts of pale sunlight piercing through the dense canopy, a cold mist clinging stubbornly to the undergrowth. Ethan Cole crawled out of the cave, his small frame stiff from the hard stone floor and his breath puffing white into the crisp air. Beside him padded Ashfang, the gray wolf, its fur damp with dew and its gait still uneven from the old wound that marked it. The boy's stomach gnawed with hunger, but it was fear that truly hollowed him when the silence of the forest broke with a chorus of distant howls. Ethan froze. His wide blue eyes darted toward Ashfang. The wolf was already bristling, ears forward, golden eyes scanning the tree line. A low growl trembled in its chest, deep and resonant, vibrating through the boy's bones. The howls were not singular. There were many, answering one another in a pattern Ethan instinctively knew spelled danger. A pack. Minutes later, the shadows between the trees thickened into forms, wolves. Not one, but 4, maybe 5, emerging cautiously, their bodies lean and strong, fur darker than Ashfang's silver coat. Their eyes glowed amber in the half-light. Ethan pressed back against the cave mouth, his fingers trembling as he clutched at the stone. Ashfang stepped in front of him, hackles raised, its lips curling back to reveal white fangs. The lead wolf was larger than the others, a brute with thick black fur streaked by scars across its muzzle. Its stance was predatory, confident, head low as it padded forward. Ethan could see ribs showing beneath its coat, a reminder of the hunger that drove such creatures. The boy felt his heart thundering. He had no weapon, no strength, no chance. His survival now rested entirely in Ashfang's battered body. The standoff snapped when the black wolf snarled and lunged forward. Ashfang exploded into motion, leaping with surprising speed despite the limp. Teeth clashed, snarls split the air. The two wolves collided in a flurry of fur and muscle. Ethan cried out as blood spattered the leaves. Another wolf circled, fangs bared, but Ashfang wheeled and snapped, driving it back with a furious growl. Ethan's body shook with sobs as he crouched in the cave mouth, watching his unlikely protector throw itself again and again against impossible odds. Ashfang's injured leg faltered, but still it lunged, still it fought, still it stood between him and death. The boy's tears blurred his vision. For the first time, his desperation shifted. He was no longer only trying to live. He was terrified of losing Ashfang. This wolf, broken and scarred, had chosen to guard him. He pressed his fists to his eyes, whispering through tears, "Please don't leave me. Please fight. I'll help you, I promise." The clash of bodies filled the clearing. Ashfang sank its teeth into the flank of one attacker, sending it yelping into the trees. Another tried to dart past, eyes fixed on Ethan, but Ashfang barreled into it with a snarl so deep it seemed to shake the earth. The pack hesitated. Perhaps it was the ferocity of Ashfang's defense, or perhaps it was the boy's frantic shouts echoing against the stones. But one by one, the wolves melted back into the shadows. The black wolf lingered longest, staring with eyes that promised it would remember this day, then turned and vanished into the forest. Ashfang staggered. Its chest heaved, its gray coat matted with blood from shallow slashes. Ethan rushed forward, throwing his thin arms around the wolf's neck despite the danger of sharp teeth. "You saved me," he whispered. The wolf leaned against him, trembling but did not collapse. Together they retreated back into the cave, the boy pressing his body against the animal to offer comfort that his tiny frame could barely provide. Far away, back in Copper Hollow, Sheriff Hank Whitmore and Clara Jennings dismounted at the edge of a ridge. From here, the land rolled into valleys thick with timber. Hank knelt, brushing aside pine needles to study the earth. Wagon ruts, older now but clear, cutting toward the deep woods. He followed them with his eyes until they vanished into shadows. "He brought the boy out here," Hank muttered. Clara's brow furrowed, her pale cheeks flushed from the chill. "But why? Why leave a child to die?" That question lingered as they rode back into town to gather more. Hank decided the only way forward was through the man himself. He found Russell Kane drinking at the saloon, his hulking frame slouched over the bar. Russell's dark beard was unkempt, his gray eyes narrowed with suspicion when the sheriff entered. "Evening, Kane," Hank said evenly. Russell grunted without looking. "If you're here about the boy, he's run off. I told you." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing. Those wagon tracks out by Bitterroot Creek look an awful lot like yours. And there were small footprints alongside, barefoot." For a flicker of a second, Russell's mask slipped. His jaw tightened, his hand gripped the glass too hard. Then he forced a laugh, a hollow sound. "You think I'd drag a child out there to die? Sheriff, you're losing your edge." At a corner table, Caleb Morton, a wiry man in his late 30s with hollow cheeks and darting eyes, watched intently. Caleb was a known card player, his debts whispered about in every back alley. Clara, who had accompanied Hank into the saloon, noticed how Caleb avoided Russell's gaze. She stepped closer, her sharp mind reading what the sheriff already suspected. Afterward, outside under the lanterns, Clara pressed Hank. "He's hiding something. Kane's drowning in debts, isn't he?" Hank nodded slowly. "Word from Helena is he owes half the county. Ruth's land was the only thing of value left. If Ethan's gone, Kane gets it free and clear." Clara's eyes hardened. "Then this isn't just neglect. It's murder by another name." Hank said nothing, but the steel in his gaze answered her. The forest wore a cruel silence that morning, the kind of silence that comes before violence. Dew clung to the needles of the tall pines, and the mist curled low along the ground, making the Bitterroot woods seem endless, suffocating. Somewhere in those shadows, Ethan Cole crouched inside the mouth of the cave with Ashfang, the gray wolf, still recovering from wounds inflicted by the pack the night before. The wolf's breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of its flank reminding Ethan how fragile their survival was. He brushed his dirt-streaked hands across the animal's fur, whispering, "I'll keep you safe, I promise," though he knew not how. Miles away, Russell Kane was tightening his grip on a rifle while his boots sank into the damp earth of the forest floor. He had not come alone. At his side walked two hired hands, Jed Briggs and Coleman Cole wardmen whose reputations were whispered in every saloon from Helena to Missoula. Jed was a bulky man in his late 30s with a thick beard and heavy jaw, his eyes cold and empty like a man who had buried his conscience years ago. He was known for his temper, quick to violence when liquor burned in his veins. Cole Ward, by contrast, was lean, wiry, and fox-like, with sandy blonde hair and sharp cheekbones that gave his grin a cruel edge. His narrow green eyes seemed to miss nothing, calculating every weakness. He had drifted from town to town, working as a gambler and sometime bounty hunter, never long enough to grow roots or earn trust. Russell's gray eyes were hard with determination. His debts had grown too loud, the men he owed pressing closer with each passing day. The land that Ruth Cole had left behind, Ethan's rightful inheritance, was the only thing that could save him. And so he marched deeper into the trees, hatred tightening his jaw. "We finished this today," he muttered. Jed grunted in agreement. Cole smirked and spun the revolver in his hand before holstering it. The plan was simple. They would set traps around the cave where Russell believed the boy might be hiding, then smoke him out or shoot him if he tried to run. As they walked, Cole unrolled a bundle of iron bear traps, their teeth sharp and rusted, clanging ominously when snapped open. Jed carried a length of chain and a flask of oil, the tools of men who were comfortable with cruelty. Russell's heart pounded not with guilt, but with the cold calculation of a man convinced survival excused everything. At the same time, Sheriff Hank Whitmore and Clara Jennings rode through the lower valleys, following the faint trail of wagon tracks that Russell had left behind days earlier. The sheriff's broad shoulders were hunched forward, his weathered face set in grim focus. His rifle was strapped across his back, and his gray-blue eyes scanned every tree line for movement. Clara rode behind him, her wool coat pulled tight, auburn hair tied back, determination burning in her green eyes. She had not spoken much since they left town, but her silence was not fear, it was resolve. When they dismounted near the creek, Hank knelt to study the earth again. There, pressed into the mud, were 3 sets of boot prints. He recognized Russell's heavy stride instantly, and the other 2 bore the telltale shape of hired guns. Clara knelt beside him, her breath catching. "He's brought others," she whispered. Hank's jaw tightened. "He's not looking for Ethan. He's hunting him." Clara touched his arm, her expression fierce despite the fear in her eyes. "Then we can't waste time." Back in the cave, Ethan heard it first. The metallic snap of something closing on empty air, then the crunch of boots against fallen leaves. His heart slammed against his ribs. He peered from the shadows and saw men moving like hunters circling prey. Russell's face was unmistakable, his beard dark against his pale skin, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the clearing. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His stepfather's presence confirmed his worst fear. He hadn't been forgotten. He had been marked for death. Ashfang stirred weakly, raising its head and growling low, but when it tried to rise, its injured leg buckled, and it collapsed back against the stone. Ethan's panic surged. His protector, the one who had fought a pack for him, was too weak to fight again, and outside, steel jaws of traps snapped shut in preparation. He had to act. Russell gestured to Jed and Cole, who spread out, setting the cruel iron traps in a circle around the cave's approach. Their voices carried in the morning air. "Kid won't make it long," Jed muttered. "Trap'll do the work for us." Cole laughed, a dry, cutting sound. "Or the wolf will. Either way, Kane gets his land." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Rage mixed with fear until something in his chest hardened. He could not sit and watch Ashfang dragged into the jaws of those traps. His mind raced for a plan, something, anything that could buy time. He crawled to the far side of the cave, gathered a handful of stones, and then, taking a deep breath, he hurled one into the trees opposite the men. The clatter was sharp, deliberate. Jed's head snapped up. "Movement," he barked, raising his rifle. Cole darted that way with a grin, eyes sharp for prey. Russell hung back, scanning the shadows. Ethan took his chance. He sprinted from the cave's mouth, his thin body a blur of motion. His lungs burned, his bare feet tearing against the forest floor. Behind him, Russell's roar shattered the silence. "There! The brat!" A gunshot cracked, splintering bark inches from Ethan's shoulder. The boy stumbled but pressed on, weaving through trees, heart hammering louder than the bullets. His only thought was to draw them away, to keep Ashfang safe inside. Sheriff Hank and Clara were half a mile away when the gunfire echoed through the forest. Hank snapped to attention, his eyes blazing. "That's them," he growled, swinging into the saddle. Clara followed without hesitation. They spurred their horses forward, racing toward the sound. Ethan burst into a clearing, gasping for breath. Russell emerged behind him, rifle raised. The man's face twisted with fury, sweat beading along his temple. "You should have stayed in the cave, boy," he spat. "Would have been quicker." Ethan's legs trembled. He had no weapon, no defense, but his fear was eclipsed by defiance. He shouted, voice breaking, "You'll never take Mama's land. You'll never take me." Russell's finger tightened on the trigger. For one terrible moment, Ethan stared into the black mouth of death. Then the sound of crashing hooves and a bellowing voice cut through the clearing. "Drop it, Kane!" Sheriff Hank roared, rifle already leveled. Clara was at his side, her face pale but eyes burning. Russell's face contorted with rage and disbelief. His finger twitched on the trigger, but Ethan dove sideways at the last instant, the bullet whistling past his ear and burying itself in a tree. Hank's rifle thundered in reply, a warning shot that split the air and sent crows spiraling into the sky. Jed and Cole stumbled back into the clearing, weapons half raised, their bravado faltering under the sheriff's glare. Russell growled like a cornered animal, but for the first time, doubt flickered in his gray eyes. And through it all, Ethan crawled to his knees, tears cutting through the dirt on his cheeks, his gaze flicking back toward the cave. His wolf was still there, still trapped, still vulnerable. He realized then that his fight was not over. Surviving his stepfather was one thing, saving Ashfang was another. His purpose had shifted again, sharpening like the edge of Hank's rifle. The forest clearing held its breath, sunlight slanting through the canopy in jagged streaks, turning the mist into threads of gold. Ethan Cole crouched, chest heaving, eyes wide with terror as Russell Kane, his stepfather, stood above him with the rifle leveled at his chest. Russell's gray eyes blazed with desperation, the eyes of a man who had run out of time, out of excuses, out of humanity. His finger tightened on the trigger. The world seemed to slow. Ethan braced himself for the final crack of death. But before the rifle could fire, a blur of gray and muscle shot from the tree line. Ashfang, the wounded wolf, hurled itself with all the strength left in its battered body. Its massive jaws clamped onto Russell's arm, forcing him to scream as the rifle clattered to the ground. The sound that split the clearing was not just a snarl, it was a roar, primal and thunderous, the voice of the wild claiming justice. Ethan scrambled backward, crying out. He saw Ashfang's teeth glint as it wrenched the weapon from Russell's grip. Russell stumbled, cursing, striking the wolf with his free hand, but Ashfang did not yield. Only when Jed Briggs and Cole Ward raised their guns did the standoff break. Sheriff Hank Whitmore's voice bellowed through the trees. "Drop your weapons, all of you!" The sheriff strode into the clearing, rifle leveled, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed as immovable as the mountains behind him. His salt-and-pepper hair caught the light, and his steel-gray eyes burned with righteous fury. Clara Jennings followed, her coat whipping in the breeze, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked on Ethan. Jed froze first. His brutish hands trembled as he glanced at Hank, then at Russell pinned beneath the wolf's weight. Cole's cruel grin faltered, his narrow eyes darting, calculating the odds. Neither man liked what they saw. Slowly, grudgingly, they lowered their weapons. Russell screamed, "Shoot the damned wolf! Shoot it now!" But no shot came. Hank's rifle never wavered. His voice dropped into something colder, heavier. "This ends here, Kane. You've lied, you've schemed, and now you've tried to kill a child. You'll answer for it." Clara rushed to Ethan, her arms pulling the boy close. He clung to her, tears streaking down his dirt-stained cheeks, his voice breaking. "He wanted to kill Ashfang. He wanted to kill me." Clara whispered fiercely into his hair. "Not anymore, Ethan. Not anymore." Hank advanced, kicking Russell's rifle further from reach. "Call your beast off, boy," Russell spat, writhing under Ashfang's weight. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on the wolf's scarred head. "It's okay," he whispered, his small voice cutting through the chaos. "You've done enough." Ashfang's jaws loosened, and it stepped back, though its golden eyes never left Russell's. The sheriff bound Russell's wrists with rope while Clara stood protectively over Ethan. Jed and Cole, cowards now without pay or purpose, were disarmed and forced to the ground. The forest, which had felt like a tomb for days, suddenly felt alive again, filled with the sound of justice settling like thunder after a storm. 2 days later, the town of Copper Hollow gathered at the square. Word of Russell's arrest had spread like wildfire. The townsfolk came in droves, their voices buzzing with disbelief and outrage. At the steps of the courthouse, Sheriff Hank recounted what had been uncovered. Russell Kane's mounting debts, his lies about Ruth Cole's death, his plan to abandon Ethan in the wilderness to seize the land. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Martha Greeley, the sharp-tongued widow, spat on the ground and muttered, "I knew that snake was rotten." At the sheriff's side, Ethan stood close to Clara Jennings. The boy was pale and thin, his clothes tattered, but there was a new light in his eyes, fear tempered by courage. Clara, tall and graceful despite the hardships she had endured, rested a hand on his shoulder. Her heart ached at the sight of him clinging so desperately to her presence, as though she were the last safe harbor in the world. She had made her choice in those woods. Ethan would not be alone again. She would become his family. Russell was dragged through the square in chains, his beard unkempt, his eyes darting with the desperation of a cornered animal. The jeers of the townsfolk rose, echoing against the wooden facades of the saloon and mercantile. Caleb Morton, the gambler who had once worked alongside Russell, slunk away into the crowd, unwilling to be tied to a man whose downfall was sealed. In the days that followed, Clara took Ethan into her modest home near the schoolhouse. The boy, though scarred by grief and fear, began to adjust to the rhythm of safety. Warm meals, a clean bed, and the sound of Clara's voice reading him to sleep. The townsfolk brought gifts, a coat too big for him, boots worn but sturdy, a notebook and pencils. Ethan clutched the latter with surprising reverence, filling its pages with sketches of wolves, mountains, and stars. Ashfang, too, found a second chance. Dr. Samuel Hart, the the town's veterinarian, a kind man in his 50s with spectacles perched low on his nose, treated the wolf's wounds with gentle hands and steady patience. "Old fighter like this," Hart said as he cleaned the gashes. "He's earned peace." When the wolf was strong enough, Hank and Clara arranged for it to be taken to a protected valley north of the town, a wild sanctuary where hunting was forbidden. Ethan had cried bitterly at the parting, his small hands gripping Ashfang's fur, whispering promises. Clara had knelt beside him, her eyes soft with tears, and whispered, "He'll still be watching. Wolves never forget their pack." Weeks passed. Russell Kane was tried swiftly, his crimes undeniable. Jed and Cole turned on him to save themselves, testifying about the plan to murder Ethan. The jury of Copper Hollow men and women had no mercy. Justice was delivered, cold and final. But Ethan's life had shifted in a way deeper than courts or verdicts. He had found a mother again in Clara Jennings, who treated him not as a burden, but as her own blood. At night, when fear still crept into his dreams, she was there with a lantern's glow and gentle hands. By day, she encouraged him to draw, to speak, to believe again that he belonged somewhere. And always, when dusk painted the sky in fire and gold, Ethan climbed the small hill at the edge of town. There, against the horizon, he often glimpsed a silhouette tall, proud, unmistakable. Ashfang stood upon the ridge, silver coat gleaming in the last light, golden eyes fixed on the boy below. Neither moved for long moments. Then Ethan would raise his hand in silent salute, and the wolf would dip its head as if answering. It was not farewell. It was a promise that the bond, forged in terror and despair, would never break. That a boy abandoned in the wilderness and a wounded wolf had found one another at the edge of death, and in doing so had created something stronger than fear, something eternal. And as the sun slipped behind the mountains, the townsfolk would sometimes glance up and see the boy and the wolf locked in that silent exchange, and they too would feel the truth. Sometimes, family is not bound by blood, but by survival, by trust, and by love born from the wild. Life often shows us that the ones who protect us do not always look like heroes at first glance. A wounded wolf, a lonely boy, a caring teacher, and a sheriff who refused to stay silent. Together they remind us that trust, courage, and kindness can be found even in the darkest places. In our everyday lives, we may not face wolves or wilderness, but we do face fear, loneliness, and people who would take advantage of us. This story tells us we are never truly alone. There is always hope. There is always someone or something ready to stand by us, and there is always a new family waiting where love is given. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. May God bless you and your family with protection and peace. And if you believe in the power of loyalty, love, and justice, type Amen in the comments below.